let's come back to the book, because it is very, very nicely and gently satirical. And I know that you're in interviews and book reviews about it, different comparisons have been made between, this book and other writers. And Jonathan Franzen actually came to mind. Do you think that's a fair comparison? Because it's sort of very witty, quite sort of sprawling, and lots of different generations all sort of thrown together.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoy Jonathan Franzen's writing. I personally, I feel like it's not an apt comparison, just because I see him as a very static writer. Actually, I think that he's very good at portraiture, and particularly kind of portraiture in ensemble. But I feel like he's not actually a writer of movement or of narration, of getting people through, kind of pushing his characters through changes and kind of through choices. I think that quite often he becomes a bit clunky.
A bit clunky.
I'm sorry.
No, I think that's very beautifully put. That's a very good description, and there is a lot of movement in your books. And I said we'll go back to the specifics of Birnam Wood in a moment. And obviously, everyone, I don't need to tell you, Macbeth shall never, I've said this earlier, Macbeth shall never vanquished be until great Birnam Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him. Now, let's go back to the Luminaries, because that was, absolutely massive book for you. I mean, it's a long book, and it's a historical novel. I mean, what was it? Again, you must have been asked this a million times, but the effect on you, and the youngest ever Booker winner as well. It must have been sort of absolutely fantastic, but at the same time, I imagine quite sort of nerve-wracking to have that kind of attention. And it kind of led to this thing where you sort of had an argument with the New Zealand state.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredibly, that's true. It was a very overwhelming amount of international attention all of a sudden, but I found the national attention within New Zealand the hardest to bear in a way. The Prime Minister who kind of singled me out in the episode that you're referring to, I had gone to a literary festival in Jaipur in India, and had made some remarks about the government of the time, which I did not vote for and didn't think much of. And I'd kind of used a list of adjectives, not unlike one that might appear in this book, actually, in the mouths of one of the characters. I'd called them neoliberal and shallow, and I'd said that they didn't care about culture or anything long-term, but all they cared about was short-term gains. And kind of incredibly, the Prime Minister used a spot on breakfast television, which he had reserved for himself every week, to attack me, basically, to come to single me out. I hadn't even mentioned him by name. I'd just been talking about my country's government. But he encouraged the New Zealand people to not to listen to a word I said, kind of reassured everybody that I didn't know what I was talking about. And then a lot of his associates in the right-wing media in New Zealand picked up the story and kind of amplified the latent misogyny into blatant misogyny in such a way that it became this kind of national story that it's kind of incredible to reflect back on now, because it almost seems funny because it was so outrageous.
It wasn't funny at the time.
It was not at all funny at the time. It was headline news basically everywhere you looked for the better part of a month. And I was called all sorts of names. I was called a traitor to the country for having spoken out against the government, and called ungrateful. That was kind of the biggest theme of the conversation, centered on kind of my ingratitude as I suppose as a young woman kind of daring to have an opinion. And it made me feel very bitter and very angry for a long time. It really depressed me. I kind of wish now, when I look back on it, that I could have some sort of sassy comeback story, kind of this tale of how I kind of said said something really bold and brilliant back, but I just felt very crushed by it. And kind of even worse than crushed, began to fear that what the Prime Minister had said and what had been reinforced in the very mainstream media over this protracted time might in fact be true, that I actually might not know what I was talking about. I used a word, for example, the word neoliberal, that at the time I did have a sense of what it meant. I had an instinctive sense of what it meant. I did have instinctive repugnance to it. But I might have been hard pressed to define it, and so I became very I kind of lost a lot of self-confidence, I suppose. And my way of dealing with this depression was when I could finally find it in myself to read again. I kind of lost the ability to read for a while. I went to the bookshelf, basically. I went to the bookstores and started reading a lot about political theory, activism, just kind of politics and economics in general. I was determined that if it ever happened again, that I would kind of be, I would have some comebacks in my pocket. Yeah. And so the ironic thing, I suppose, is that out of all of that reading eventually came my next book. So it did have a happy ending in the long term. But I mean, it's a funny thing with New Zealand, because I think that it's a country that is very used to being thought of as this kind of progressive paradise. Those are the words that kind of come to people's minds when they think about it. And in many ways, it is a very progressive country, but there are also these kind of deeply regressive secrets about the country that a lot of people would be quite surprised to learn. And the more I started thinking about that, the more I wanted to push that into a book somehow. That kind of duplicitous self-image, I think, that the country has as a whole, and this kind of terror of the world knowing in anything other than the kind of the nice story, that Prime Minister at the time had chosen for himself a ministerial portfolio. So in New Zealand, in addition to being the Prime Minister, you're also the minister of something else, and the Prime Minister can choose their own portfolio. And he had chosen the Ministry of Tourism for himself. So in addition to being the Prime Minister, he was also the Minister of Tourism. And it had always struck me, especially at the time, but kind of more and more when I thought about it, that was a very strange thing for him to have done, and even maybe possibly an anti-democratic thing for him to have done. That as a Minister of Tourism, the people who you're thinking about principally are not citizens. They are people who you have no responsibility to take care of them. You want to give them a good time. You want them to spend as much money as possible in your country, but you kind of want to advertise to them in a way that may or may not be true, And I think that out of that prime ministership, with that kind of strangeness of him holding that portfolio, there came this requirement that many New Zealanders feel, that you must always present the country in the best possible light overseas. There's this kind of sense of, you must sweep everything under the carpet, So the fact that inequality is rising in New Zealand faster than almost anywhere else on the planet, you must not talk about that. You must not talk about the fact that 80% of our rivers are unswimmable. These quite shocking facts when you think of this supposedly clean, green country.
And it seems like, actually, ill thought through on his part, because it's a kind of rather daft, if you think of him as a sort of diplomat for the country, it makes him look like Erdogan. Or we've had Elif Shafak, Turkish novelist. That's the kind of thing that happened today. She was basically put in prison. It's not a million miles away from that kind of strongman dictator behavior from a country, as you say, which is advertised its liberality. No, not at all. And now I know from the reading I've since done that the reality probably was that there was some other news item on his desk that day that nobody else knew about, but he probably talked to his advisors and thought, oh shit, we better create some storm elsewhere to deflect from this much worse story that we're really pleased
the country doesn't know about.
The really good thing is that as a novelist, you can sort of exact witty and subtle revenge over many, many pages a few years later.
Well, I do get my very, well, witty is kind. I get my very petty revenge in this novel, actually, against him, specifically because, very hilariously to me, this Prime Minister, Sir John Key, as he now is, revived knighthoods that had been abolished in New Zealand in order for him to be able to give himself one when he left office. So,
well, there's a character in the book who's, you know, he's not, well, what do we say? He's baby boomer, and a sort of small businessman, and he's a sir. I was quite surprised when, you know, this republic, you know, famously Republican country, New Zealand, was handing out sort of baronetcies and things like that. I didn't know. So that was an invention of the guy who sort of basically tried to cancel you.
Oh yeah, well, I don't think they're not really baronetcies. I don't think they're attached.
No, they don't. Yeah.
Yeah, it's, I mean, it's
knighthood,
country of contrast, I guess, as every country is. Yeah.
Well, tell us a bit more about the book. I'll tell people who haven't read it yet. The sort of core of it is a battle, or a very sort of complicated, dysfunctional relationship, perhaps better put, between an American billionaire, and we could talk about where he comes from. You know, he's obviously not based on one single person, but he made me think of someone like Peter Thiel, who is with the first Facebook investor, a bit Elon Musky, maybe like the guy who runs Airbnb, or even Matson in Succession, a little bit, although Matson's obviously not American. And anyway, he's a billionaire, he's paranoid, and he sort of encounters or gets involved with, or the other way around, a group of really, you know, sort of nice, young, idealistic kind of Extinction Rebellion, Occupy type people, and with sort of disastrous results. So I'll probably leave it there. But it is a political book, and we were chatting earlier, Eleanor, and you said that among the people who you were reading, you know, while writing it was David Graeber, and you know, we used to do a lot with David Graeber. He's written for the magazine. I interviewed him. We did one of these 3 years ago, and to me, a brilliant writer, probably one of the best political writers, probably the cleverest as well, and a great sort of stylist. Again, sort of witty. Without that, I mean, you take aim in the book, well, through your character Tony, who becomes more sympathetic, I think, as it goes on. And I think he's a bit like you, is he? I don't know. But you know, Tony takes aim at this sort of slight sort of the piety of the left, and the way, particularly now, it's probably always been there, but the sort of authoritarian tendencies that the left has, and yeah, so I guess interested to find out about your Graeber reading and how he kind of influenced the book.
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, that came out of that period that I was describing earlier. I was just kind of feeling my way, really, and then as the book took shape, as the idea for the book took shape, that reading became a little bit more focused, as I realized that in order to create a character like Tony, who's one of these younger activist types, I would need to have quite a firm grounding in what he probably would have read. So he's very much kind of shaped by his reading in political philosophy. He majored in that in the book. And I had almost no familiarity with political philosophy at all. So I wanted to kind of do a lot of reading that he read the things that he would have written, that he would have read, in order to be able to kind of inhabit him, I suppose. And then, you know, Occupy was, it was really big for people of my generation, I think. You know, that had happened. So when the global financial crisis happened in 2008, that was right when my generation we were all graduating with our master's degrees in creative writing, you know, kind of into this world that was very, very inhospitable to us, and the kind of the way that crisis was dealt with by kind of rewarding the very people who had brought it about was so dispiriting. And I think that for me, Occupy and the election of Barack Obama in the United States was kind of this part of this kind of mood at the time of great hope that was then kind of dashed in this very kind of slow and disappointing way. But you know, I all of David Graeber's books, really, the Democracy Project in particular, where he talks about Occupy, I quite self-consciously modeled the Birnam Wood meetings on the Occupy kind of format.
Right.
And the principles of unity that the group has, that they read out at the beginning of every meeting, is also kind of cribbed from Occupy, because I thought that they probably would hold Occupy in quite high esteem.
You say crib, but there's a sort of there's a bit of teasing going on, isn't there? I mean, I found those scenes to be sort of quite funny, because you know there is some you know, there's something comedic about those the earnestness of those meetings and whether they sort of have to stick to the rules. And I think you bring and it becomes, you know, some of them become extremely awkward.
Oh yeah, I mean, there are also people who love enforcing the rules. I mean, this is a great problem with anarchy.
No, and Mark Fisher's another one, isn't he? Can you tell us a bit about him, for those who don't know about him?
Oh, sure. I mean, the most influential book I read of his was called Capitalist Realism, which is a beautiful kind of slim little book. That it's a lot about the media and the stories that we imbibe, I suppose, and kind of repeat. And yeah, and so I was very much kind of trying to capture the flavor of a kind of activism that had this kind of moment right before the kind of turn towards the alt-right that started happening kind of in Obama's second term, you know, or that had its seeds, I guess, back in this time period.
Well, let's hear a bit of this. I asked you earlier, there's one page 141, I think, of the book, which I just thought was such a brilliant bit of writing, and it's kind of quite Joycean, but it's, you know, I think it demonstrates what you've just been saying.
Shall I read it out?
It's one long sentence. Could you read it out? I think it's just so great.
Okay, I've never read this out before, so I might stumble.
Okay.
But
Okay.
this is in the point of view of Tony. So the morning after the disastrous vote at Birnam Wood, Tony had awoken in his childhood bedroom with an idea for an article so fully formed in his mind that it was almost as though he had written it already in his sleep. The piece would be a searing indictment of the super rich. He would expose remorselessly those hypocrites and cynics who publicly denied the catastrophe of climate change while secretly short-selling that very same position and hedging all their bets. The millionaires and billionaires who preached self-reliance while accepting vast handouts in the form of subsidies and easy credit, and who bemoaned red tape while building contractual fortresses to shield their capital from their ex-wives. The tax-dodging economic parasites who treated state treasuries like casinos and demanded and dismantled welfare programs out of spite, who secured immensely lucrative state contracts through illegitimate black channels and grubby, endlessly revolving doors, who eroded civil standards, who demolished social norms, and whose obscene fortunes had been made in every case on the back of institutions built with public funding, enriched by public patronage, and rightfully belonging to the public, most notably the fucking internet. The confirmed sociopaths who are literally vampiric with their regular transfusions of younger, healthier blood. The cancerous polluters who consumed more and burned more and wasted more than half the world's population put together. The crypto-fascist dirty tricksters who pretended to be populists while defrauding and despising the people, who lied with impunity, who stole with impunity, who murdered with impunity, who invented scapegoats, who incited suicides, who encouraged violence and provoked unrest, and then who then retreated into a private sphere of luxury so well insulated from the lives of ordinary people and so well defended against them that it basically amounted to a form of secession.
Yay. Yeah, that's amazing. And so that came out of this reading that you were doing, but it's also kind of what you're thinking.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think so.
Yeah.
I think that this is a problem that New Zealand has greatly exacerbated in the world. You know, New Zealand has been famously hospitable to the you know, to the ultra rich of the globe. It's a country with an extremely regressive tax structure. There's no capital gains tax at all in New Zealand. The top tax rate is incredibly low. It's at the moment it's about 8 percentage points behind the UK's, but it was much greater than that before the previous government. You know, New Zealand has fawned over the world's narcissists and psychopaths, to kind of bring it back to what was being discussed earlier. And I think that we you know, that they should have to think about that in some way. You know, there's the idea of having a farm in New Zealand, a piece of land that you're going to flee to when, you know, the rest of the world is presumably dying in some big blaze. I mean, what a horrific idea. How could this country have possibly been facilitating that, you know, against its own, it's against its own, you know, the interests of its own people, but it's also against the interests of people all around the world. It's just unconscionable. And so I do feel very angry about that. Yeah. Well,
one of them is Peter Thiel, because he famously bought some sort of one of these sort of bunkers in New Zealand with staff and, you know, sort of 24 security, and he also is, you know, a Trump supporter, who's supposed to be libertarian, but, you know, takes a lot of government money.
Totally. He became a New Zealand citizen. Such was the obsequiousness of the New Zealand government that they didn't even require him to come to New Zealand or to a New Zealand High Commission in order to receive his citizenship. They flew to him. So they went to some place in Santa Monica or wherever he was. And at the time when he became a New Zealander, he had spent a total of something like 8 or 10 days in the country in his life. And so the one thing that the country wanted was his money, you know, and it's horrible. It's just, you know, meanwhile, there are refugees from, you know, basically everywhere you can think of, including for New Zealand, many people in the Pacific, who New Zealand has a real relationship with these countries who are facing kind of rising sea levels and kind of changing weather patterns and so on. Yeah, so I think that this idea of complicity was it kind of powered the novel, but I also knew that, you know, a novel has to be entertaining. It has to give readers a reason to keep reading, and that, you know, it has to delight and to surprise and to kind of have something to say. And I think I realized early on with this book that anger wasn't going to be enough, that actually, you know, in a sense, a book needs to be a corrective, or it needs to offer a corrective to everything that the writer feels is wrong with the world. It can't just simply repeat that, the kind of repeat those wrongs. Yeah.
And it's not just a polemic. I mean, you're the young millennials who are involved in this campaign. I mean, they don't come across that well either.
Oh,
and this idea of complicity, because, you know, they're complicit in the whole thing too, aren't they? And I think that's what perhaps Tony's trying to point out, that they're complicit with their iPhones and their Instagrams and their Facebooks, and, you know, so there's this kind of surface adherence to things like Occupy or Extinction Rebellion or so on, but actually everyone's just addicted to the Silicon Valley platforms, which are making money out of them by selling data to advertisers. And even more than that, you know, the devices that we're using right now to speak, and that everybody, myself included, is just kind of so hopelessly addicted to. All of these devices are made out of the very minerals that you find out quite early on in this book, that the billionaire in question is up to more than he than the public realizes in New Zealand. He's secretly mining rare earth minerals inside a New Zealand national park, which came to me as a complete fiction, and very recently has been in the news in New Zealand as a real news story. So that's very chill. That's brilliant. That's amazing.